All right. So, up until now, we have covered all sorts of different ways to study human cognition, other cognition, artificial cognition, in a variety of ways. This is trying to figure out the nature of thinking things, right? So, physical simple systems, neural networks, dynamical systems theory, these are all different approaches that we've seen that all kind of tackle somewhat different questions, but they're also, broadly different wheelhouses, you might say, that the work can live in. And we've also seen findings from kind of all over the place, right? A wide variety of different fields are involved in cognitive science. Cognitive psych, linguistics, computer science, AI, neuroscience, all these things that we have dipped into over the semester. And the key concept there is that cognitive science is an interdisciplinary endeavor. The brain is one of the most complicated things we've ever seen in the universe. It has more synapses than there are known stars. That kind of level of complexity. And also, if you think about a star, it's not all that complex. Actually, it's just kind of smashing elementary particles together, right? The brain, on the other hand, is very deeply complicated. And so to address those questions, to even ask a lot of those questions, we have to not just can, but have to draw on explanations from all over the place, right? So we need things from different levels of explanation. So, say AI is very high-minded, cognitive psych is a little more rooted, and then neuroscience and neurobiology, which are somewhat distinct, we're figuring out how things relate up and down that sort of spectrum, but also from different domains, right? So to understand certain linguistic failings or sort of speech impediments, you might need to draw from abnormal psych, but also cognitive psychology and some anthropology maybe for cultural questions, and also, of course, linguistics, right? So different separate domains also need to come to bear because we're thinking things embedded in a real world, right? So a cool thing about this is that you can do a lot of good work just integrating findings at a very kind of a local level. You say a lot of the things we've seen so far are connecting a couple of different findings and saying, hey, these things, they relate to one another. For instance, you'd have to have explanations of linguistics and computational neuroscience to get that overregularization error that we looked into, right? Went versus goad, remember, for past tense verb overregularization. But there's also an issue with that kind of approach is that you end up a little bit narrow. You're a little bit too down in the weeds to explain some broader questions. So the question is, how should we approach very broad theories of how the mind works and the cognition involved and all that? Doing that, as opposed to just finding individual findings, we might be able to better predict, like, okay, where are the holes in our overall understanding of mind? So here's a little allegory. If we have a tree, right, and we have a squirrel, we can analyze a lot of things, a lot of interesting things about the squirrel's life in the tree, right? We understand maybe how it moves around the tree. We understand how it interacts, what it does with the acorns in the tree that it's living in, how it nests, that kind of stuff, right? Good stuff. But again, this is a very local explanation. It's connection between just two things in isolation of everything around it. So what are the broader questions you could ask about this dynamic, this relationship between a squirrel and its tree that might cover different, areas that aren't just restricted to this one mammal and this one plant, right? So first question might say, is this a forest? We might also ask, what else might live in that tree? From bugs to birds, what else is going on in here? that might help us make sense of this dynamic system that we're trying to study. Are there other trees like it? Is this a zoo? Is this a yard? What's the context? Does something eat the squirrels here? Or is the squirrel totally left alone? What's the temperature like? What's the climate like? All of these questions are broader questions that try and integrate the squirrel in the tree into a better overall understanding of what exactly is happening in their dynamic, but also in the world around them. So, squirrels and trees is this concept of, you could ask infinite questions about the interaction between squirrels and trees and other things, and they would all be very interesting questions. But without a broader concept like ecosystems, climate, food chains, life cycles, you miss a lot of other interesting information. You might be missing the ways to ask better questions about what drives a squirrel. If you had no concept of climate, or perhaps even seasons, you might be confused as to why the squirrel starts burying its acorns in August. Well, the concept of seasons helps you much better understand that behavior. So this falls into a thought that one of the founders of cognitive science has, to warn off certain kinds of narrow-minded research, and I don't mean that as an aspersion, just the narrow focus of certain research. 20 questions. Have you ever played 20 questions? 20 questions is a game where you get to ask one yes or no question, and I will tell you the answer each time about some object that I'm thinking about or talking about. So you might say, okay, is it a plant? No. Is it an animal? Sure. Is it a mammal? Yeah. Is it is it furry? Yes. Is it brown? Sure. Is it a bear? No. Is it a squirrel? Yes. Okay, you got there in 7. Or was that 6? Who knows? Doesn't matter. Point is, the idea here is that you are iteratively chaining together these pieces of information, these questions, to just detect yes or no, does this exist? Yes or no, is this correct? And that's a valid way to find information, but it leads to a very narrow chain of investigating just the depth of one very small thing, and it avoids broader questions of where does all of this stuff fit together, right? It's very linear. Alan Newell, one of the founders of cognitive science, said famously, you can't play 20 questions with nature and win. His point is that nature is just too complicated. It's too complex. You can't simply ask single yes or no questions over and over. P is less than 0.05. Ooh, yes, this is a true thing. You need to start making models that are a bit more complex themselves, right? You need something that can say, okay, I can fit concepts from neuroscience and concepts from cognitive psychology in here. And thus, you'll need to ask questions about more complex tasks. You can't just focus on, okay, in this one very isolated moment, I can see exactly how this monkey's, brain firings work under this condition versus this condition. You can do that, of course, and it's useful to do that. But his point is that the longer we spend asking singular questions and not making sort of broader predictions and more complex models, the longer we'll be kind of stuck with our wheels in the mud. So, how can we then chase down Newell's hope, right? Hope for more complex models and asking questions about more complex tasks. Well, there are a few different attempts at global integrations. And it can be kind of hard to wrangle all these pieces together. So we've talked before about levels, and so this is the first way we're going to talk about this. It's a good way to describe different findings, right? You can say, okay, this neural pattern, it fires only when someone is experiencing facial recognition, right? That ties together sort of a cognitive thing to a neurobiological type thing, right? But this is a good way to find connections between different levels and domains is by using the concept of levels. So Mars levels, once again, if you recall, computational is the high-level description of like whatever the process is trying to do. Algorithmic is what steps you would need to take to achieve that, and then implementational is the low level, like the hardware. Okay, if I want to achieve those steps, how do I implement that in the real world, right? So let's look again at one of the phenomenons we talked about in understanding vision from Mars levels. Have a look at zero crossings. So the idea here is that we can visually detect edges in the world, right? We know this. Remember this shape, how the only reason you can tell it's this oblong square and not some weird parallelogram is it's a box, right? Is that you can see there's a difference in shade of this blue between each surface, right? But how does that work from the bottom up? How do we chase that all the way from neuron level up to a more obvious, sort of cognitive explanation? So let's look at an example that implements this, the levels of visual processing that Marr proposed in his vision model way back in the day. So we start with this is the image, right? Let's consider this is maybe the edge of one of those boxes, right? We have the surface on the top is the lighter blue, and then on the side is the darker blue, right? The photoreceptors would try to pick up. Let's just talk about neurons that can detect luminance. So photoreceptors come in and say, when there's light present, I'm bright, and when there's not any light present, I am dark, right? So we might have 3 rows or columns of these. Doesn't really matter how they're technically arranged, but the idea is you would have a neuron for each spatial location, right? Some sort of neural activity. This is how your retina works in your eyeball. You pick up a certain amount of light from the world, and maybe only the lighter color is brighter. It's a stronger signal in the neural level, whereas the darker color doesn't fire as much. So the pattern you would get in the photoreceptors is something like this. You'd see a bunch of bright at the top in a similar arrangement to a bunch of dark at the bottom. Bright being, firing, and dark being not firing. Then we can talk about the zero crossings. How do we detect a zero crossing specifically? And this is the idea that, like we saw with the way that the perceptrons work, right? They can take, we can give them different weightings. We can say, these 2 neurons that are right next to each other, for example, we're going to calculate zero crossings when something changes from one shade to another, right? So let's say these 2 neurons, I could integrate them to achieve the signal of a different one. So only if these 2 neurons have different signals will this one light up. And we can do that up and down. So we would have one less neuron because we'd have to be, we're linking them up 2 at a time to 1. But they'll overlap. So top to bottom, that would be something like this. So the idea being that there's only, looking at every single pair of those input neurons, starting at the top left, just looking at the top, the first row and the second row. Those are both white. Those are both on. That would not produce a signal. Keep going down, down, down until you get to, there is a crossing here. There's a bright neuron, there's a firing neuron, and a not firing neuron. I will light up. But then we go back to non-firing neurons and we stay dark. So the zero crossings just detect those edges. So now we have an arrangement of neurons that are saying, I can tell when there is an edge here. Even further, now we can ask questions about orientation. So if I say, so now I can ask the questions like, here is a zero crossing. Here is one of those edges that I've detected. Now I need to know, is there another edge nearby this is how we can detect orientation. We can say, from this one lit up edge neuron, where is my neighboring edge neuron, right? The one that is also firing. If I can answer that, I can tell what direction these are the neuron, the angle of the edge is going. I can see, you can see now how I could potentially have a neuron, one at a time, that's hooked up to many of these in the zero crossings, and say, that I can detect an edge. So now I can understand what orientation this edge is at a neural level. I have a neuron dedicated to that. And you can start to see how more of the rest of Mars model comes to life, right? If I can just keep making connections and saying, oh, okay, so if I see these three edges and this vertical edge together, that's a T or something, right? Or an A. To angle the forward slash, the backslash, and the horizontal bar in a particular arrangement, that's an A, right? So being able to recognize shapes and symbols and patterns out of just zero crossings, out of just this simple step-by-step process from light into neurons and then neurons combining together. So you could chase this up the chain to surfaces, 3D models, other structures, all the way up to things like facial recognition. You can have, you have a small area of your brain dedicated to picking up information from everywhere else to say, am I looking at a face or not? It's pretty useful. Knowing that you're being watched is a good thing to have at your disposal. So, okay, what we've done here is just show how we can connect a couple of different levels of this, of the pursuit of cognitive science. But, this is a good way of approaching this because some of the processes are going to fit together in this nice nested hierarchy, right? Clearly, to be able to have face recognition at this cognitive level, all these other things have to be in place, and that's fine. But it helps us see sort of the nested nature of everything. But it requires a lot of specificity. We have to know what the tasks are. We have to know what their inputs and outputs are. We have to know how they should be done, right? We know that we must be able to parse 3D information in the world. And we also know how these little neuron segments work together. We know that neurons fire when the threshold is met. That's just a fact. We know that, in conditioning, way back to the behaviorists, the associations are formed with repetition. These are very clear, simple rules of how cognitive, some of the things in cognitive science. But, again, the mind is way too complex to rest at just that, right? We can't just say, oh yeah, so therefore all the way up the chain to consciousness, creativity, insight. Some of that, yes, and certainly neurobiology has to factor into that, and computational neuroscience will help shed light on it, but they're not all just nested under one another. They are interconnected. They inform each other mutually. And so that's the idea of needing to draw from many, many places for our models to be able to fit them together. So now we're going to talk about another approach to integrating cognitive science as a whole, and that is cognitive architectures. So this is a way of saying, hey, we have a boatload of findings from all over the place, lots of cognitive science, lots of things from neurobiology, lots of things from, basics of linguistics even, that kind of stuff, and say, I think I can draw out the architecture of this agent that makes it behave in a fairly human way. Or human because that's the one we've studied best, but in a sort of a cognitive way. So the idea is you would break up the components of these architectures into known features of the mind, right? And the goal is to try and approximate some aspects of cognition, the things that you are, the some of the ways we do some cognition, right? And these architectures typically rely on this modularity idea. The mind is in functional modules that can handle specific, very rigorous subtasks. Remember our friend Fodor. So, memory might be its own module, visual attention might be its own module, and they can interact, right? Things that I see, I might pass on to memory, but they operate distinctly. So there's a load of how do you conceptualize one of these architectures? So the idea of a cognitive architecture is to be able to use that format to create a model of some specific thing, some specific task. So how does it do that? It takes some kind of task knowledge that you bestow the model, that you give to the model. It takes some kind of task environment in which it can actually behave, and then you feed those into the cognitive architecture, which is, this friendly little robot. And the goal is it should produce something close to human behavior. Not necessarily identical, but things like how long it takes to remember a little piece of information that is well studied. That's a pretty strong thing that we pretty well understand in terms of cognitive psychology. But now if we encode that into this system and make it a constraint, now every time this cognitive agent needs to remember something, it has to do it in a kind of a human way. So the idea is that there's a whole bunch of simulated mechanisms inside of the architecture itself that are common to basically all of our cognitive abilities, right? So no matter what task I'm doing, I'm going to have these same kind of faculties going on. And, a good thing here is that they are reusable. These architectures are, they're maintained centrally. They're a group effort by the cognitive research community. And they're updated by theory. So every time something new is found, you can update the entire architecture to say, hey, this is a better way of doing it. This is a complex model of some aspects of human cognition. And so, all to the point that cognitive modelers, ones who actually write models using these architectures, can leverage these systems to make highly plausible and highly generalizable models. Meaning they're both fairly realistic according to known science, and also one of the goals of Newell was to say this is a model that can behave in many different circumstances, right? It's not just a singular model of one thing that we managed to capture in the laboratory, but it's a general model that attempts to predict behavior in lots of different settings. Before we move on, I want to make a note that every model is wrong. That's just true. It wouldn't be a model otherwise. I believe we've covered this to some extent. Otherwise, it would be the whole real thing. So every model is a reduction. It's some kind of, there's something missing from it. But the goals of these architectures is to make them as complex as possible and simultaneously as not wrong as possible, if that makes sense. So, cognitive architectures in general, there's a few different kinds out there. ACT-R, adaptive control of thought, rational, is the one that we'll be looking at most. And this one is built entirely from empirical findings, starting with memory. But there's other interesting cognitive architectures out there. The semantic pointer architecture and Nango. That one's very fun, actually. It simulates the flow of information using bundles of simulated neurons. So it captures a lot of processes at a lower level, simulating individual neuron firings, but you're allowed to combine them and compile them into bigger structures. SOAR is a modeling architecture that focuses on finding, sort of problem-solving type stuff, trying to find the shortest solutions to general AI problems, like in things like you might do with chess, right? How do I navigate the space of possibilities quickly from knowing nothing? Not the same as our friend Deep Blue, who was custom built for chess. SOAR does all kinds of stuff, anything knowledge-based, but Chess is a good example because we talked about state spaces and all that. Another one is Clarion. This is a cognitive architecture that tries to do lots of low-level neural simulation mapped on top of the top-down, more sort of abstract stuff of the mind. So sort of a neural modeling and physical symbol system approach. These are all different. They're different styles, and they're all trying to capture a different subset of human behavior. The one we'll talk about primarily is ACT-R, which is focused on interactive behavior and memory, sort of like the moment-to-moment behaviors of completing a task. So let's talk ACT-R. Adaptive control of thought, rational. It is not a catchy name, but actor, actor, it has something going for it. Developed initially in 1990 by John Anderson at Carnegie Mellon University. He's still kicking. He still works on this project to this day. And at the start, it was just a model of how memory decays when students are learning algebra. Specifically, it's always been in service of how do we help model student learning so that we can, better understand their processes, right? But the cool thing about it is that initially it was designed to be modular. That is, there were two kinds of memory, but you could add any other kind of module to expand the capabilities of ACT-R. So other things over time were added, things like vision. How does this system take in information from the outside world? Motor action. Can we simulate key presses in a way that humans typically do, right? So at present, ACT-R has 8 main modules in its brain, you might call it. This is the ACT-R brain. You have the outside world at the front, so information from the task comes in. And then you have the outside world at the back end to notice that this is not how the brain is laid out spatially. This is just a symbol that I'm using. But the general idea is that information will come in either the vision module or the audio module. There is a procedural module that sort of coordinates everything in the middle. There's 2 memory-based, like momentary, like working memory-based modules at the top. Imaginal for keeping track of lots of information temporarily, and goal for remembering what the heck am I doing right now. And then the declarative module is more like long-term memory. Things I know and have studied and how I can retrieve things from there. And then finally you have 2 motor actions, both hand motor module and a speech production module, which behave in ways as similarly to humans as we can get. Things like predicting how long it will take you to move the mouse. We got that down pretty well. Assuming you know where you're going and how long it'll take, that's a pretty stereotyped, very similar action. It works. So let's talk about each of these in turn. The procedural module is at the heart of all of it, so let's cover that first. Procedural module. This is a module's understanding of how things are done, how to achieve things. So this is where the modeler would give the model some production rules to tell it, hey, you're here in the middle of this brain and you have access to all this machinery. Here's what you should do when the state of the world is like this. So every 50 milliseconds, one of these production rules can fire and say, I saw this item, I'm going to put that in memory and press the 1 key, or whatever, It has all kinds of abilities it can pull on. It can move the, quote, eyes, the simulated eyes to change what it's looking at. It can store or retrieve things in memory. It can plan motor actions. It can change the goal, all this kind of stuff. It's sort of the central processor of the ACT-R system. Next, the declarative module. So this is long-term memory. And this is the understanding of what. What are things that I just know, right? Known facts, 1 + 1 = 2. Known fact, birds can fly, right? But there's also more specific information, not such general information. These would be episodic memory. That's things like, I just saw the word dog on the screen. So a recent memory of what actually just happened in front of me is also something that would be stored in declarative memory. And what this does is it simulates the memory retrieval times, the memory decay rates. So after I see the word dog, how long can I actually remember that for? Would I even care? That kind of thing. And other stuff like how often we make errors in memory. So failing to remember that I just saw the word dog, or hope not, but failing to remember 1 + 1 is 2, right? Okay, so keep going on this tour of the ACTR brain. We'll also talk about vision and audio modules. So these are the way information comes in from the outside world. Vision, these are the eyes and ears, right? So these are both just kind of simple visual lists of what is out there in the world. So vision has things like both where and what, color. What color is the object I'm looking at? Where is it located in space? What is, if it's text, what's the content of it? This kind of stuff. So the idea is that you reduce the outside world to a list of objects that are present there. And this works for audio too. So like how long was the sound? How loud was the sound? This kind of stuff. And so the things simulated here, again, we're trying to draw from known processes, are things like how long it would take to move your attention, and how long it takes to extract information out of viewing an object in the world and actually letting it get encoded in your brain, right, in your long-term memory. We also have two more sort of working memory set. So the imaginal module and the goal module. So this is the brain's understanding of what it's trying to do right now. The ACTR brain, right? What is the current state of the world? And what's the current, like, what are my goals? What am I trying to keep track of? What am I trying to achieve here and now? You may think that you don't, oh, well, this only works if you have goals. You always have some kind of goal, even if that's just to go to sleep, right? So there is a part of your brain that is, or of the ACTR brain at least, and presumably something in your brain that replicates this idea of being able to keep track of what's happening in the task, things I might need to keep immediately relevant, like, oh, how many of that thing did I just see? But also, what are my goals and when do those change? Like, under what conditions should my goal change to a new goal? A sub-goal, perhaps. And ultimately, this is... We actually saw that these were the same originally when ACTR was first getting off the ground, but it was found that these are actually distinct. There's different brain regions involved and different overlapping functions involved, right? They don't collide with one another, and they're kind of distinct in their location of where they occur in the brain. So ACTR adjusted, and they're now two separate modules, as opposed to just one sort of task module. Finally, we have the actions that can be taken by ACTR, and these are very simple. These are ACTR's hands and mouth, right? It can produce vocal events, so things like speech. It can produce key presses. It can produce mouse movements and clicks. And the idea is that it simulates how long it takes to prepare these kinds of actions, and also how long it takes to execute them. And maybe they make an error. Maybe they overshoot with the mouse and they miss clicking the button. This kind of stuff is captured by these modules. So this brings us around. We've seen kind of all these modules and more or less how they behave together. Well, not together yet, but what are they trying to simulate in actual human behavior, and a little bit about what they can successfully do. You'll notice that this is not everything that a brain can do. There's not a whole lot of room for creativity here. We're not looking at creating new knowledge and being inspired, that kind of stuff, but it has a lot of the basics. How we take in information from the outside world, how we rearrange it, how we draw on our own memory, and how we keep track of information, and finally what actions we can take. And so, symbolically, here it is, and we put it inside a machine. Not a literal robot, but, you put it inside of an artificial agent. You use this architecture to build a model of something you want done, some task you want to complete. So let's walk through the way ActR would handle this sort of thing. Let's say we have a task to count to 5. That seems painfully simple to you, an adult, with a whole world of experience and knowledge built up. But in ActR, according to the modules that we've just looked at, every 50 milliseconds, one of these procedural questions can be asked. The first one is, what's the current number? Now, somewhere in our imaginal, when we were setting up this model, we would have said, okay, well, you start at 1, so the current number is 1. So procedural module has to say, so imaginal module, what's in the current number slot? 1. Got it. Okay. Procedural then says, oh, well, there's something there. I'm going to say out loud 1. The speech module takes over, and then I ask, what comes next? Now, to think about this from the perspective of a child who's first learning to count, we might just have an automated system that can update this very quickly with all procedural rules. We've learned how to engage quickly with this. But a kid would have to consult long-term memory, something that they've learned recently, but they're not, it's not streamlined yet. So the next question is, okay, given 1 from the imaginal current, hey, declarative memory, give me a fact about counting. Count fact 1 is 2 comes after 1. So declarative takes a moment. It has to go through the timing it would require to look something up in memory. And then it comes back with 2. Okay, cool. So now the procedural module kicks on and says, oh, declarative has given me something. I'm going to update the current number to 2 in the imaginal buffer. And then I'm kind of going to loop. Now I'll ask, hey, imaginal buffer, what's the current number? Oh, say 2. Okay, yeah, sure. 2. Got it. And so on, and so on, and so on, and so on, until it's finished. Takes about 4 to 5 seconds with some possible errors. Now think about that. It wouldn't take us that long, but again, this is modeling somebody who doesn't really know this stuff inside and out. It might take a kid this long to count from 1 to 5. And that's where this really excels. This is arranging things in real time to try and say, hey, does this look like what a human can do? And how do we make sense of that? Okay, now let's ramp it up a bit. Let's see an ActR model playing Tetris. So, we can see the pink squares show the kinds of visual things it's able to attend to in the visual world. It looks at those things and it plans, which one of these positions would be best. We sort of hand-feed it a handful of these things. And so then once it decides where to place something, it has to go through the steps of, okay, I need to move it. I need to arrange this block so I can put it in the spot I want it in. It also, you can see its attention moving around, the little circle with the fixation cross in the middle. You can see it's looking around. It's paying attention to the world, and it's making sure its pieces is aligned and all that. I wouldn't say this is a good Tetris player. I would say that it's very human-like. Except, I mean, well, perhaps even like humans, it's throwing a tantrum. It seems to have forgotten how to drop the block, so it just kind of spins it wildly. Okay, so what is all this used for? It's cool to see ActR playing Tetris, and that's kind of fun. But what's the goal? What's the use of these kinds of systems? Clearly, they have some use, but let's talk about what those are. So, first of all, one application of these kinds of architectures, and ActR in particular, is to basic science. If you have human behavior that is especially complex, lots of interactions, clicks, movements of eyes, information coming in, and actions happening a lot, it's a good idea to potentially create a model that can perform somehow like a human might under those circumstances. And depending on what we put into the model's procedural memory and declarative memory, we'll be able to create a model of whatever task we're interested in. And so what that does is it gives us this sort of a an integrated theory of, hey, Act R is handling a lot of the basic behaviors, and I've got this one idea. This is how I think people use their memories when they do Sudoku or something, whatever. And what that does is it helps us say, okay, well then if this model performs in a way that is similar to the way humans perform in terms of like reaction times and errors and that kind of thing, then it's a pretty decent model. A model that performs closer to human behavior is probably better than a model that doesn't, right? So it's a way to create these hard instantiations of basic scientific theories, cognitive theories of how people behave. And it helps to, shine a light on, okay, if this model is superior and it's the best one we've found so far, then maybe there's something right about it. And it gives us grounds to investigate more deeply. We can go in and say, okay, now how do we detect if memory is being used during this part of the task? And you would use fMRI or EEG or whatever, but you would dig in using a different set of tools. But this model serves as a good basis for saying, hey, I've got a pretty good idea of how a person might do this. Then, on the flip side, a very cool thing about this whole system is that ACT-R, as an architecture, as a scientifically driven, empirically driven cognitive architecture, it receives, support from the actual basic science. So whatever investigations you do, and, so let's say you find, we as an investigator culture find that there is a new kind of memory, something between short and long term and different from working memory, something, who knows. The idea is that ACT-R can incorporate that. I mean, originally ACT-R was just those two procedural and declarative modules designed only to model certain memory details of algebra for kids. But even last year, I was part of a group that helped to add new visual processes to the vision module. Specifically, it was like a visual grouping tool to give ACT-R a sense of, like the words on this page. They are, clearly the symbols are separate, but they're definitely grouped. You can tell which things are grouped together and which aren't. Point being that the group that performed this research did empirical basic science to say, hey, how are people actually grouping things together on the screen? And then implemented it into ACT-R. So ACT-R grew because of the basic science. It's this nice tension, this positive feedback loop. ACT-R makes predictions about basic science phenomena that we can evaluate using empirical data. And then the more we investigate those phenomena and those findings, that can help inform ACT-R to be better in the future. So beyond basic science, there's also applications in usability, in a sort of a more of applied setting. The idea is you can use a system like this to create what you could call cognitive crash dummies. So imagine you have some kind of task like being in a cockpit, and your goal is to design a better cockpit, right? So you could go through a lot of steps. You could design huge prototypes and create them and have humans test them, but that's pretty expensive in terms of time and effort. So the idea behind using a set of ACT-R models as cognitive crash dummies is you could create a dozen different cockpit designs in a virtual format, and you could give, dozens or hundreds of different kinds of models, all bound by the human restrictions of ACT-R, but slightly different in how they approach the task. And what you can do is just launch them. Let them test 100 times, 1,000,000 times. These little test dummies are not going to ever get tired or injured or bored or sleepy. They allow you to automatically look for weaknesses in the design in terms of cognition. In terms of what the kinds of things available to ACT are. It's going to make certain errors. It's going to take too long on some of these designs, and it'll highlight where some of this stuff goes awry instead of having to go through all the paces of a real world prototyping process. You can do just, hey, throw a swarm of ACTR models at it and see how they behave, because each one will give you insight. This one relies heavily on declarative memory. Oh, too many of your things look similar. They're confusing, right? This one relies on visual grouping, and too many of your panels are randomly placed and not grouped well, in a hierarchical way. So this is an approach that allows you to really make faster iteration and make it so that you can test, redesign, and retest without as many humans involved for the basic stuff. That said, this doesn't solve it. Just like it doesn't, an ACTR model is never correct. It's just a helpful, useful way of looking at a problem. You'd still want to do more focused testing as you proceed through the process, but these kinds of tools help to get rid of some of that stuff up front. So there's loads of other possible applications, that you can look at tasks from cognitive psychology. You can look at, how to help human-computer interaction with user models and things like that. And there's even some work recently to get neuroscience-type bold responses from fMRI connected to this kind of, these activations of each module, right? So localizing, hey, where might the goal module live in the brain? What's it connected to? How does all this stuff kind of play out in the real world? Again, helping to make the whole thing more plausible in a broad sense. Also, a really interesting one is cognitive tutors. It's this way that you can have an automated system. One of the best things about person-to-person tutoring is that the tutor can ask questions and probe the tutee, the student's knowledge, to figure out, oh, this is what you're missing. Okay, let me help. And so that doesn't work in automated systems for the most part. So the idea of a cognitive tutor is it can construct a model of what the kid currently knows about algebra, right? So if it knows if the kid seems to do well with subtraction and addition and all these kinds of things, then the cognitive tutoring system can create a model that has those things in memory, right? And it can keep track of this stuff. It can also create alternative models, say a model where the kid has not mastered subtraction or addition or variables or some feature of the thing they're learning. And at each step, if the kid gets something wrong, then the model can watch, see how long they take, see what kind of error they make, that kind of stuff, and it can compare it to its predictions for its current model. It's like, this kid is missing subtraction model, this kid is missing variables model. A variety of models can be constructed, and they will help the system gain insight into, well, my model of what the kid knows currently is wrong, clearly, because they didn't get this question right when I thought they would. So now I can consult, it looks like they're missing some understanding of variables. Okay, so then it can take that information and say, hey, let's go back and try to relearn variables. It seems like you're struggling with that. It's a powerful way of leveraging this human cognitive modeling approach to do something good, in an automated way. I mean, imagine if you could deploy this sort of headless, personless tutor to middle schools. You wouldn't want to replace all of the teachers, of course, and I'm speaking from experience, but you don't necessarily want to, this can help people not fall through the gaps. Imagine places where there's no access to to good education. You could have a system that's able to automatically help bring you up to speed, bring your kids up to speed. So, that brings us to the end of this discussion of Act R. It's a good example of an approach to integrating a lot of what we know about cognition under one heading, one umbrella, and creating this interconnected system of different modules that behave and perform different cognitive tasks and subtasks like retrieve something from memory or encode this in the goal, change my goal. It doesn't model all of cognition. It doesn't succeed at capturing the whole brain, and that's not really even the goal, But similar to Sherdlu, it does a good job examining how a lot of these different fundamental parts can potentially work together, and especially on a specific problem. For Sherdlu, it was a little micro world, and for Actar, it's also micro worlds, but more or less it's specific tasks, right? Design a specific task, something like Tetris or counting or whatever, algebra in between. So, hope it's clear how Actar is used, why it's a worthwhile endeavor, but also what its limitations are. It's not it's not a magical system, and it's not a whole human brain, but it's a good model that integrates lots of solid scientific evidence to create a robust, sort of general, human-ish system for writing artificial agents. This also brings us to the end of the semester. So, cognition, I hope I've conveyed to you, cognition is this very complex thing. It's one of the most complex things that we've ever found. There's more, I say this a lot, more synapses than number of stars in the known universe in your brain. That's a lot. That's a pretty big mess. And it's possible we will never have a full and complete understanding of the brain and human cognition and everything in between. Not saying that we won't try. In fact, that's the beauty of this field, I believe, is that it's inherently multidisciplinary. It connects so many different pieces of what it is to be a thinking thing, from different domains and fields and levels of explanation. And it helps us to make these increasingly useful, more robust, predictive models of how cognition works. How we do what we do every day. And I think if there's one thing I would hope you can take away from this, it's a little bit of self-reflection. You are one of these things that we spent this entire semester discussing and talking about, how does this thing work? You're asking, how do I work? What are my features? What are my components? How am I arranged? And, on top of that, I would say I hope you can take away a little bit of empathy, because if you are one of these strange beasts made entirely of neural connections and other biology, so does everyone else. And, we don't all work exactly the same, but there's a lot in common between you and your fellow. So I hope you have a newfound understanding and appreciation for being the owner of a shiny new brain, but also, it's been a pleasure. So I hope to see some of you in the fall, potentially. We'll see what happens. But otherwise, thanks for coming along on this guided tour of cognition. Take care.